It began like any other royal broadcast, cameras poised, reporters waiting, citizens unaware of the storm about to break. But when King Charles and Prince William stepped forward side by side, their expressions betrayed a truth far heavier than tradition could mask. What followed wasn't just a royal announcement, it was a nation-shattering revelation. At that moment, the monarchy itself seemed to hold its breath. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The announcement came without warning. No grand build-up, no whispered hints in the press corridors, just a sudden palace statement that left the nation stunned. A briefing was scheduled at short notice, sending shockwaves through media networks and royal watchers alike. It was the kind of abrupt move the palace rarely made unless something extraordinary was unfolding behind closed doors. Within minutes, the air outside Buckingham Palace thickened with speculation. What could have forced both King Charles and Prince William to appear together, unannounced, and with such solemn urgency? Royal correspondents began drawing comparisons to some of the monarchy's most somber moments in history. This was not a seasonal address or a ceremonial update. The tone of the briefing was unusually grave, the language in the press release carefully stripped of royal flourishes. Even seasoned reporters, who had covered decades of palace intrigue, noticed something different. It was as if the walls themselves were trembling with a secret too heavy to contain. But even before this fateful moment, whispers had already begun. Catherine's noticeable absence from public view over recent weeks had stirred quiet concern among those closest to the royal narrative. Official explanations had been vague, citing personal time and adjustments to her schedule. Yet the public, ever attuned to the rhythms of royal life, sensed something was off. Events she would have traditionally graced with her effortless presence were suddenly marked by her absence. The charities she championed released carefully worded statements. The tabloids grew restless, and questions piled up without satisfying answers. And then came the image of Charles and William together. Two figures who, though united by blood and destiny, rarely appeared in such a synchronized manner unless the weight of the crown itself demanded it. Their joint presence alone spoke volumes. The king, dignified yet visibly strained, and the prince, carrying the kind of tension that no rehearsed statement could disguise. Insiders quietly admitted that deeply personal matters were at the heart of the address, matters so sensitive that even senior courtiers had been kept in the dark until the very last hour. As the royal standard fluttered above the palace, the crowd outside grew dense and silent. Cameras zoomed in on faces etched with anxiety. Across living rooms, pubs, offices, and phone screens, millions held their breath as the live broadcast began. For a moment, it felt as though time itself slowed, as if the monarchy was standing on the precipice of something that would alter its emotional landscape forever. Eyes welled with tears before a single word was even spoken. This wasn't just about a statement. It was about an unspoken truth that everyone could feel but no one yet understood. But behind the polished podium and royal insignias lay weeks of hidden struggle, an ordeal the palace had fought desperately to contain. Until now. Long before the public ever sensed a shift, the walls of Kensington Palace echoed with whispers. Aides exchanged anxious glances, senior courtiers held late-night meetings, and trusted friends were sworn to silence. Something was unfolding within Catherine's world, a reality so delicate that even seasoned palace insiders dared not speak its name aloud. The silence wasn't born out of indifference but fear. Fear of what the revelation could mean, not just for the princess, but for the future of the crown itself. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Senior staff noticed William and Charles retreating for late-night conversations far more frequently than usual. Their meetings stretched into the early hours, their discussions shielded from even their most loyal advisors. Those few who crossed paths with them afterward described their demeanors as heavy, burdened by something far beyond ordinary statecraft. For two men, accustomed to navigating crises with composed precision, this level of urgency was startling. Palace staff had seen disagreements before, but never this quiet intensity, a kind that hinted at looming consequences. Simultaneously, Catherine began to withdraw from the informal engagements that had once defined her presence. She had always been the steady heartbeat of the royal calendar, effortlessly connecting with people, bringing warmth to every interaction. But now, certain appearances were quietly cancelled, small gatherings postponed without explanation. These ripples in the palace schedule were too subtle for the public to detect, but impossible for insiders to ignore. It wasn't just a break, it was a carefully orchestrated retreat. The palace communications team responded in the only way they knew how, by tightening the flow of information. Media access around Kensington Palace became unusually restricted. Seasoned royal correspondents who once enjoyed predictable, if limited, visibility were suddenly met with closed doors and vague statements. Photographers found their usual vantage points blocked. Even whispers to the press, a staple of palace intrigue, seemed to dry up overnight. It was a controlled narrative, meticulously designed to contain something that couldn't yet be revealed. Behind these walls, emotional tension surged. Key advisors reported an atmosphere unlike anything they had experienced before. The usual rhythms of royal life were replaced by a sense of unspoken urgency. Words were chosen carefully, movements timed deliberately, and every decision weighed against potential fallout. William, usually composed and strategic, appeared restless. Charles oscillated between paternal concern and kingly restraint, struggling to balance his personal emotions with the demands of leadership. This wasn't simply a family issue, it was a matter of national significance, wrapped in personal pain. Conflicting briefings only deepened the mystery. Some aides whispered of medical concerns, others alluded to personal battles too sensitive to share. The lack of clarity wasn't accidental, it was strategic. The palace was walking a tightrope, torn between their instinct to protect and their obligation to prepare for what was inevitably approaching. Every layer of the story seemed to contradict the last, as if truth itself was being carefully held back, waiting for the right moment to shatter the silence. Within these clandestine movements, one thing became clear: a decision loomed that would reshape not just the family's dynamics, but the monarchy's immediate future. Those who knew even fragments of the situation understood that protocol alone wouldn't be enough to manage what was ahead. This wasn't a scandal to be silenced or a routine health update. It was something deeper, something that demanded both caution and courage. The weight of the impending moment grew heavier with each passing day, pressing against the walls of Kensington like a gathering storm. And yet, no amount of protocol could shield the royal family from what was coming, the moment when a private storm would spill into public view. It was as if Catherine had simply disappeared. One week she was radiant, commanding attention at state events. The next, she was gone. No hospital sightings, no casual photographs, just silence. For a woman so deeply loved and constantly in the public eye, this sudden vanishing set off alarm bells across Britain and beyond. Was this a planned retreat, or the beginning of something far more troubling? The timeline of her withdrawal was unnervingly abrupt. In late autumn, Catherine had been at the heart of royal engagements, graceful, composed, and visibly thriving in her role. She had led high-profile charitable initiatives, appeared beside William at key state functions, and exuded the quiet strength the public had come to rely on. Then, without warning, her name vanished from upcoming schedules. Official calendars were quietly revised. Invitations were retracted with carefully worded statements citing unforeseen adjustments. At first, the shift seemed temporary, but days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the silence grew louder. The media quickly picked up the change in rhythm. Scrutiny intensified as journalists noticed a pattern of cancellations too consistent to ignore. Royal correspondents pressed the palace for clarity, but the responses remained maddeningly vague. Terms like personal time and rest were repeated with almost scripted precision, as if designed to deflect rather than inform. In a family accustomed to calculated transparency, this sudden opacity stood out. Reporters began drawing parallels to moments of historical royal crises, when silence had often been the first sign of something seismic beneath the surface. Public unease only deepened when William's demeanor began to shift. Known for his controlled composure, he appeared increasingly distracted during his public appearances. His speeches were shorter, his interactions less fluid, and his eyes often carried the weight of someone wrestling with an invisible storm. Royal photographers noticed his subtle withdrawal from light-hearted moments that once defined his engagements. For a future king, every gesture is analyzed, and this change didn't go unnoticed. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Catherine's inner circle began to shrink. Friends, who had long been regular confidants, found communication limited. Senior aides were instructed to maintain strict confidentiality. A fortress of silence rose around her, impenetrable even to many within the palace. The few who remained close to her offered no explanations, only cautious reassurances that everything was under control. But their controlled tones revealed a different truth, something private, intense, and not yet ready for public eyes. Eventually, faint leaks began to emerge. Whispers from unnamed sources spoke of a deeply personal battle Catherine was facing. The details were deliberately vague, but the phrasing itself carried a heavy emotional weight. This wasn't a temporary illness or a diplomatic scheduling gap. It was something personal, serious, and carefully shielded from the glare of the world. Each leak, no matter how controlled, only fueled speculation further, creating an information vacuum that no palace statement could fill. As the silence stretched, public anxiety reached a fever pitch. Across social media, hashtags like #WhereIsCatherine and #PrayForKate began to trend globally. Comment sections filled with theories ranging from the sympathetic to the outlandish. The nation that had watched her journey from a young woman into a beloved royal figure now found itself grasping at fragments, desperate for any sign that she was safe and well. Even international outlets began dedicating segments to the mystery of her disappearance, amplifying the pressure on Buckingham Palace to respond. For the monarchy, Catherine's absence was more than a personal matter. It was a growing public crisis. She wasn't just a royal consort, she was a cultural anchor, a figure whose presence stabilized public sentiment. And now, that anchor was gone, leaving a gaping silence that no carefully drafted statement could soothe. As Catherine's absence stretched on, Buckingham Palace reached a breaking point to either confront the truth or risk losing control of the palace narrative entirely. While the public speculated wildly, a single night behind palace walls would determine everything. Charles, William, and the most trusted royal advisors gathered in a dimly lit chamber away from curious eyes. Every word spoken that night carried centuries of legacy on its shoulders. It wasn't just about Catherine, it was about the monarchy's stability itself. The decision to convene this extraordinary meeting wasn't taken lightly. For days, palace corridors had been filled with unease, whispers of impending change swirling without clarity. Now, in the quiet of night, the heart of the monarchy faced a reckoning. Only a handful of individuals were permitted to enter the room, each one sworn to absolute secrecy. The stakes were nothing less than the preservation of public trust in an institution that had weathered wars, abdications, and scandals, but rarely something this intimate, this emotionally raw. From the moment Charles and William sat across from each other, the tension was palpable. For the king, this was about duty, legacy, and protecting the monarchy's fragile balance. For the prince, it was about love, fear, and the unbearable weight of a husband watching the woman he loves face an ordeal too personal for headlines. Their discussions were not cold political calculations. They were charged, layered with decades of shared history and unspoken expectations. William pushed for discretion, for more time to shield Catherine from the world's scrutiny. Charles, however, feared that silence was becoming dangerous. The longer the palace held back, the more room the public had to create their own narratives, and those narratives were growing by the hour. Senior courtiers, seasoned in the choreography of royal announcements, found themselves in uncharted territory. Some argued fiercely for maintaining privacy at all costs, believing that Catherine's battle should remain within the family's walls until she chose otherwise. Others stressed the peril of continued vagueness. Public faith, they warned, was built not only on tradition, but on carefully timed transparency. Too much secrecy, and whispers could turn into doubts that might linger for years. It was a debate that laid bare the institution's deepest dilemma, the line between private humanity and public expectation. William sat at the center of this storm, torn between two roles that suddenly felt irreconcilable. As a husband, his instinct was to protect Catherine, to shield her from the relentless gaze of millions. As the heir to the throne, he carried a duty that demanded openness and leadership. The weight of both identities pressed down on him, leaving him visibly torn. His father's gaze met him not with authority alone, but with the heavy empathy of someone who understood too well the price of wearing the crown. It wasn't a clash of wills, but a collision of love and duty. After hours of fraught discussion, a decision began to crystallize. There was no perfect path forward, only the one that carried the least damage to both the woman they cherished and the institution they served. It was agreed that Charles and William would appear together before the world. A joint emotional address is a rare, symbolic gesture reserved for moments of extraordinary gravity. It would be a message not from a monarch and his heir, but from a father and a son standing united at a moment of deep personal and national significance. The words they would speak had to be measured, compassionate, and unwavering. Even as they finalized their decision, the gravity of what lay ahead lingered like a shadow in the room. Everyone present understood that what they were preparing to reveal would not merely inform, it would shake millions. The revelation would strip away the protective layer the palace had tried to maintain for weeks, exposing the royal family's emotional core to the world. And as dawn broke over London, the stage was set not for celebration, but for heartbreak broadcast live to millions. Then came the words that froze time. King Charles's voice wavered, William's eyes glistened, and for the first time, the two most powerful men in the monarchy spoke not as rulers, but as a father and a son struggling to share unbearable news. It was about Catherine, and it was devastating. The address began in complete stillness. Millions across the world watched, their eyes fixed on a moment that felt both historic and heartbreakingly intimate. Charles took the lead, his normally steady tone softened by visible emotion. He spoke with measured pauses, as if each word carried the weight of generations before him. There was no grandeur, no regal detachment. This was a father standing before his people, trying to steady his voice as he revealed the unimaginable. His words pierced through centuries of royal protocol, stripping away the layers of formality that so often shielded the monarchy from public vulnerability. As the king's voice trembled through his statement, William stepped forward. It was at this moment that the mask of princely composure slipped entirely. His voice cracked, betraying the inner turmoil he had held tightly for weeks. He didn't speak as the future king. He spoke as a husband, a man whose world had been shaken to its core. His words were raw, unfiltered, and filled with a sincerity that left viewers in stunned silence. This wasn't just another royal announcement. It was an emotional fracture made visible to the world. And then came the revelation that would leave the nation breathless. Catherine was facing a deeply personal and life-altering battle. It was not a minor setback, nor a fleeting absence. This was something profound, an ordeal that would reshape both her role within the monarchy and her personal life for the foreseeable future. The language was careful, yet unmistakably serious. The palace was not merely asking for understanding. It was preparing the public for a future defined by uncertainty. Within moments, the impact of their words reverberated far beyond the palace gates. Across Britain and around the globe, shock turned into collective grief. Social media flooded with prayers, disbelief, and heartfelt messages of support. The hashtags bearing her name soared to the top of global trends as millions shared their sorrow and solidarity. People who had followed her journey for years found themselves united in an outpouring of empathy that transcended borders. This was more than a royal revelation. It was a shared human moment, a collective gasp that echoed through living rooms, newsrooms, and city streets alike. What struck many most was the sight of Charles and William standing together, united in a way rarely seen before. The generational divide that had often defined their relationship seemed to dissolve in that moment. The king and his heir, usually separated by layers of duty and expectation, appeared side by side as father and son, their bond visible through shared pain. It was a moment of unprecedented emotional unity, one that spoke volumes without needing explanation. The crown itself felt less like an institution, and more like a family trying to hold itself together under the weight of something overwhelming. The palace concluded the address by confirming a period of royal adjustment. Engagements would be reshaped, priorities realigned, and the public asked for patience and compassion. The tone was clear. The coming months would bring profound changes, not just for Catherine, but for the monarchy's day-to-day rhythm. It was a moment that signaled the start of a new, more fragile chapter, one that neither Charles nor William could fully control. But while the world reeled, inside palace walls, an even more turbulent storm raged, one involving loyalty, legacy, and fear of the future. The announcement didn't just unite the public, it fractured the family. Behind closed doors, not everyone agreed on the palace's path forward. Old rivalries resurfaced, fragile alliances cracked, and whispers of betrayal began to circulate. Catherine's battle had exposed deeper wounds within the House of Windsor. In the days following the emotional address, the palace became a pressure cooker of competing agendas and clashing loyalties. While the world mourned alongside the royals, within the family's inner circle, tensions quietly festered. The decision to reveal Catherine's personal struggle had not been unanimous, and in its aftermath, the fault lines between different royal households became unmistakable. Each faction interpreted the situation through its own lens, and what should have been a moment of unity quickly turned into a subtle power struggle. One of the earliest points of contention was communication strategy. William and his team favored transparency, believing the address had strengthened public trust by showing raw emotion and honesty. In contrast, certain courtiers attached to other branches of the family bristled at the level of vulnerability displayed. They feared it set a dangerous precedent, one that stripped the monarchy of its traditional mystique and could leave it exposed to future scrutiny. These differences weren't spoken aloud in formal meetings, but they reverberated through late-night calls, guarded conversations, and whispered briefings. The careful choreography of the royal household was beginning to unravel. Adding to the unease were Queen Camilla's alleged private concerns. Behind the polished exterior, she reportedly voiced discomfort over how swiftly and overwhelmingly public sympathy had shifted toward Catherine. In a monarchy built on perception, attention is power, and Catherine's emotional gravity now overshadowed nearly every other royal figure. While Camilla remained outwardly supportive, those close to her noted moments of unease, as if sensing that the public's gaze had decisively moved away from the reigning queen toward the woman they now saw as the heart of the institution. It wasn't open hostility, but a quiet recognition of shifting tides. Amid this growing divide, Princess Anne emerged as an unexpected stabilizing force. Known for her blunt pragmatism and fierce loyalty to duty, she stepped into the fray not with emotion, but with clarity. She reminded those around her that the monarchy's strength had always depended on its ability to weather internal storms without allowing them to spill into public view. Anne's calm but firm approach provided a rare anchor in a sea of emotional and political turbulence. Her quiet influence began to shape conversations that might otherwise have spiraled into open discord. William, however, was in no mood for palace politics. He had reached a point where his role as heir was overshadowed by his role as husband. Fiercely protective of Catherine, he clashed with advisors who continued to push for a more traditional, restrained approach. He refused to allow her ordeal to be reduced to carefully curated statements or polite deflections. To him, this wasn't just an institutional moment. It was personal, and anyone who underestimated that found themselves on the receiving end of his quiet but unmistakable defiance. Meanwhile, Charles found himself navigating an excruciating balancing act. On one hand, he was a grieving father figure, deeply affected by Catherine's situation and the emotional weight it placed on his son. On the other, he was the monarch, tasked with preserving the institution's stability at a time of intense public scrutiny. Every word he spoke and every decision he made had to walk the line between compassion and control. Those closest to him observed the strain etched into his demeanor, a man torn between legacy and love. As these personal and political battles played out, subtle but undeniable power realignments began to emerge. The emotional center of the monarchy was shifting. William's assertive stance, Anne's quiet influence, and Catherine's unprecedented public resonance were altering dynamics that had remained stable for years. The carefully maintained equilibrium between the different households was no longer intact. In its place was a fragile, evolving structure shaped not by protocol, but by emotion, loyalty, and the unpredictable weight of public sentiment. As the family wrestled with its own fractures, the nation's gaze turned toward Catherine herself, yearning for a sign, a message, anything. And then, without a single spoken word, Catherine reached out to the world. A single gesture, quiet, brief, but profoundly symbolic, ignited waves of emotion across continents. It wasn't a statement. It was a heartbeat, sent from behind palace walls. After weeks of silence and growing public anxiety, a message finally emerged not through a press conference or televised address, but through something far more intimate. It came in the form of a handwritten note, simple yet deeply personal, released through official channels, but unmistakably in her own voice. There were no elaborate phrases, no political undertones, just a few carefully chosen words that carried the weight of her strength and the quiet resilience that had always defined her. To many, it felt like Catherine herself was reaching out and placing her hand over the nation's heart. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Crowds began to gather outside royal residences, arms filled with flowers, candles, and letters. Streets once filled with speculation now became places of shared emotion. Strangers stood side by side, united not by curiosity, but by genuine care. Across the country, landmarks were illuminated in quiet tribute, and vigils were held without any official instruction. The people responded instinctively, as if her silence had spoken louder than any royal speech ever could. Royal commentators were quick to dissect the meaning of her gesture. Some described it as a quiet act of strength, a subtle yet powerful assertion of her presence without demanding attention. Others saw it as her way of reminding the nation that she was still here, fighting, enduring, and aware of the love being sent her way. Unlike a formal address, this small message carried no filter of palace advisors or polished language. It was raw, honest, and unmistakably Catherine. For William, the impact was deeply personal. Those close to him noticed a visible shift in his demeanor in the days following the message. For the first time in weeks, his expression carried a hint of relief, as if the burden he had been carrying alone had been shared, even briefly, with the millions who loved her. It wasn't just about reassuring the public, it was about reaffirming their bond in the face of extraordinary pressure. The woman who had been his anchor had, even in her silence, managed to stabilize a nation. Charles, too, responded in his own way. During private engagements, he spoke with rare emotion about Catherine's grace in silence, acknowledging the profound effect her quiet strength had on both the family and the country. For a monarch who often struggled to balance personal sentiment with public duty, his words were a striking testament to how deeply Catherine's gesture had resonated within the royal household. It wasn't simply a show of unity, it was admiration for a woman whose poise under pressure had captivated the world. In the aftermath of her message, public loyalty surged to unprecedented levels. Catherine was no longer just admired, she was cherished. Her symbolic act had solidified her place not only as a royal figure, but as a central pillar of national identity. She represented endurance, grace, and humanity in a way that transcended titles. Her absence had created a void, but her message filled it with something far more enduring: hope. But even as hearts swelled, the monarchy knew the hardest chapter was yet to come, a future reshaped forever by what came next. And then, without a single spoken word, Catherine reached out to the world. A single gesture, quiet, brief, but profoundly symbolic, ignited waves of emotion across continents. It wasn't a statement, it was a heartbeat sent from behind palace walls. Weeks of silence had left the public clinging to fragments, desperate for any sign that the woman who had become a cornerstone of the modern monarchy was still standing strong. And then, suddenly, it came. A message handwritten in Catherine's unmistakable tone was released through official channels. There was no formality, no carefully staged royal language. It was simple, honest, and intimate. The kind of message that bypassed the polished surface of monarchy and spoke directly to the people's hearts. It didn't reveal details, but it carried an emotional weight that no press statement ever could. It was her way of saying, "I'm still here," without needing to utter a single word. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Across Britain and beyond, people responded with a tidal wave of emotion. Crowds began gathering outside royal residences almost instinctively, bringing flowers, candles, handwritten letters, and keepsakes. The cold silence that had hovered over the monarchy was replaced by a collective warmth, as if millions had exhaled at once. Streets echoed with quiet solidarity. Families, strangers, and generations stood side by side, not as passive onlookers, but as participants in something deeply human. Catherine's gesture had struck a chord that transcended titles or status. It reminded people why they loved her in the first place. Royal commentators were quick to interpret the significance of the act. Some described it as a quiet act of strength, a masterful yet deeply personal way of communicating resilience without spectacle. Others noted that it carried layers of symbolism, her refusal to be defined by silence while still choosing dignity over drama. It was a calculated, graceful response to a growing tide of speculation. Through that subtle message, Catherine reminded the world that her story was hers to tell, in her own time and in her own way. For William, the shift was visible almost instantly. After weeks of carrying the emotional weight of both public expectation and private fear, this message brought a flicker of relief. Those around him noticed a change in his demeanor, a softening, a quiet reassurance that he was no longer holding the burden alone. Catherine had spoken in the way she knew best, through quiet resolve. For a man torn between duty and love, it was a moment of shared strength that steadied him in ways no official statement ever could. Charles, too, reacted in a way that revealed the depth of his admiration. During private engagements, he reportedly spoke of Catherine's grace in silence, acknowledging how her understated act had accomplished what grand declarations could not. For a monarch who understood the power of symbolism, this was a moment that reminded him that true leadership sometimes comes through vulnerability, not control. Her message hadn't just reassured the public, it had reaffirmed her role at the emotional center of the royal family. Public loyalty toward Catherine surged like never before. She was no longer just a royal figure admired from afar. She had become a symbol of quiet endurance and unity. Her message reminded people that beneath the crowns and titles stood a woman who carried herself with courage and humility. Across every corner of the nation, her influence deepened, her bond with the public strengthened, and her place in national identity became unshakable. But even as hearts swelled, the monarchy knew the hardest chapter was yet to come, a future reshaped forever by what came next. Catherine's struggle didn't just touch lives, it forced an empire to look inward. With Charles and William at the helm, decisions loomed that would reshape the future of the monarchy itself. It was no longer business as usual. Everything from protocol to succession whispers was suddenly on the table. In the wake of her message and the emotional wave it unleashed, Buckingham Palace entered a period of intense strategic recalibration. Behind closed doors, emergency sessions were convened to examine how the monarchy would move forward in light of Catherine's changing role. Senior courtiers, advisors, and members of the royal household gathered to confront uncomfortable questions about engagement schedules, public expectations, and the image of a monarchy now forced to navigate unprecedented emotional terrain. What had once been a carefully choreographed institution was now adjusting to a new reality, one shaped not by ceremony, but by compassion, vulnerability, and Catherine's profound influence on the public. William emerged as a pivotal figure in this moment of transition. No longer able to simply follow the path laid out for him, he stepped into a new kind of leadership, one that required balancing his responsibilities as heir with his role as a devoted husband. He became the bridge between tradition and a modern, emotionally resonant monarchy. Advisors described his involvement in planning as more hands-on than ever before. He scrutinized decisions, weighed their impact not only on the institution but on his family, and refused to allow Catherine's situation to be managed through cold protocol alone. His leadership began to signal a shift. The future king was not just preserving history, he was reshaping it in real time. Charles, too, faced his own reckoning. A lifetime spent preparing to uphold the institution had not prepared him for this, a moment where personal and public roles collided with such force. For the first time, he appeared willing to accelerate certain transitions to ensure stability. Whether through delegating more responsibilities to William or reconsidering long-standing traditions that no longer fit this new chapter, Charles showed an adaptability that surprised even seasoned observers. He recognized that the monarchy's strength in this moment depended not on rigid adherence to the past, but on its capacity to evolve. Catherine's influence extended far beyond her physical presence. Her struggle became a catalyst for transforming how the palace communicated with the public. Gone were the carefully distant, overly polished briefings that had defined earlier eras. In their place emerged a tone of transparency and empathy, shaped by the unprecedented bond she had forged with the nation. Advisors began rethinking how announcements were framed, how moments were shared, and how the institution could maintain its mystique without alienating the very people whose loyalty sustained it. Catherine had, unintentionally, ushered in a more emotionally transparent monarchy, one that spoke not just through tradition, but through humanity. Public demand for openness intensified. The outpouring of love for Catherine had made one thing clear: people wanted to feel connected, not managed. They expected updates that were sincere, not ceremonial. This shift placed immense pressure on palace communications teams, who now had to walk the tightrope between preserving royal dignity and honoring the emotional investment of millions. For an institution that had built much of its power on selective silence, this was a seismic change. Behind the grandeur of official statements, another battle quietly brewed. Intense debates took place over titles, roles, and the long-term structure of the monarchy. Should certain duties be redistributed permanently? Would Catherine's role evolve into something symbolic rather than active? What did this mean for succession timelines and public appearances? These were not mere administrative questions, they were existential, touching on the very heart of how the crown would define itself in the years to come. And as the monarchy prepared for a new chapter, one question lingered. How would Catherine's personal battle redefine the crown's destiny? As the sun set on a day unlike any other, Britain found itself united in shared uncertainty. Streets were quiet, news anchors spoke in hushed tones, and millions whispered the same silent prayer. Catherine's future had become the nation's heartbeat. The crown might be ancient, but its fate now rested in something far more fragile: hope. Across the country, emotional vigils unfolded in a way not orchestrated by palace officials, but born from the collective will of the people. Church bells tolled softly in towns and cities, marking the weight of a moment that went beyond politics or tradition. Families lit candles in their windows. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder in silent unity, their faces illuminated by a shared reverence. This wasn't just sympathy for a royal figure, it was the manifestation of a bond that had quietly grown over the years, now revealed in full force when the monarchy needed it most. Amid this national stillness, the royal family carried their own private burdens. William, who had spent weeks shielding his emotions for the sake of duty, allowed glimpses of his inner world to surface. Behind palace walls, those close to him spoke of quiet moments where the gravity of everything seemed to settle on his shoulders at once. He wasn't just a prince waiting. He was a husband, watching the woman he loved endure something he could not control. That duality, heir to the throne and devoted partner, had become his defining struggle, and now the world could almost feel it with him. Charles, too, found himself in deep reflection. For a monarch who had waited a lifetime to ascend, he was suddenly faced with the humbling realization that legacy is not measured in crowns or titles, but in love, fragility, and shared humanity. He had spent decades preparing for constitutional challenges, political scrutiny, and questions of succession. But nothing had prepared him for this. In his quieter moments, He reportedly spoke of the weight of watching the future he had long envisioned, reshaped by forces no royal decree could control. For a man often seen as guarded, these reflections revealed a profound awareness of the moment's significance. Catherine's influence, meanwhile, began to transcend her title in a way few could have predicted. She was no longer simply the Princess of Wales, the future queen consort, or a royal figure bound by ceremonial duties. She had become a symbol of resilience, a mirror in which millions saw their own struggles, fears, and hopes reflected. Her silence had spoken louder than words. Her vulnerability had strengthened the bond between the monarchy and the people, and her personal battle had become a shared emotional journey that stretched far beyond palace walls. The global response was equally powerful. Leaders, celebrities, and ordinary citizens from across continents sent messages of support, highlighting Catherine's international significance. Her story resonated not just as royal news, but as a human narrative that crossed cultural and political boundaries. The monarchy, often criticized as insular and distant, found itself at the center of a worldwide conversation that wasn't about power or politics, but about empathy, courage, and hope. Within the palace, the family understood they were entering uncharted emotional territory. The monarchy had faced wars, scandals, abdications, and constitutional crises, but never had it experienced a moment quite like this. It was a time defined not by declarations, but by shared silence. Not by strategic maneuvers, but by collective emotion. The institution stood more united than it had in years, but also more vulnerable. This vulnerability didn't weaken it. It made it real, tangible, and closer to the people than ever before. And so, with the world watching, the House of Windsor stood at the edge of history, its next steps uncertain, its story forever changed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.